Hi, this is Stan Bush.
Hi, this is Stephanie Calvert.
This is John Payne.
This is Jack Hughes.
Hi, I'm Carrie Stevens.
Hey everybody, this is Prescott Niles.
Hello, I'm Kofi Baker.
And you're listening to Play That Rock and Roll.
Let's talk first briefly about the music scene that Ronnie and the Ronettes came up into, okay, of the early 1960s. This was before the Beatles had arrived in America, before the British invasion. Can you give sort of a brief overview of what the American pop music scene was in those years, and how did Ronnie and the Ronettes fit into that?
Yeah, a lot of people kind of view this as sort of like the dark ages after the first wave of rock heroes had all either died or gone to prison or got into the army, and pre all the excitement of the Beatles and the British invasion. And it's kind of a derivative oversimplification to say that this was the era of teen idols, kind of like, okay, industry people up in the Brill Building up in Upper Manhattan that crack the code on what the kids are listening to, so we're going to make these pre-packaged people like Fabian or Frankie Avalon and people like that. That is kind of an oversimplification, but stereotypes are true for a reason, and there was a lot of that stuff out there. Ronnie really began, her first musical love, and she, every time I interviewed her, she would always say his name in very reverent tones, was Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers. What a Fool's Fall in Love, I'm Not a Juvenile Delinquent, all these great early rock and roll songs. I mean, he was a kid, I think he was like 12, and he had that prepubescent voice that Ronnie could sound just like him. And so she a lot of what her energy came from the streets, the street corners, doo-wop groups where kids singing on street corners up in Spanish Harlem, where she grew up in Upper Manhattan. And so she brought a lot of that energy into the scene. She and her sister and her cousin started singing at family events, basically getting up on the coffee tables, and I think her uncles rigged up a stage spotlight out of an old coffee tin. And so they started singing. They had to do the going to, the Brill Building and kind of showing people what they could do. It wasn't a case of like doing the Beatles thing where you're going out clubbing and hoping to get discovered. They, the way she tells the story is there's a very famous club called the Peppermint Lounge in Midtown Manhattan, and that was kind of like the hot spot for a bit in the early 60s. A group called Joey D and the Starlighters had a very famous song called the Peppermint Twist that kind of made it, immortalized it.
Everything was the twist back then.
Everything
had a twist.
And Chubby Checker really good. We all owe him residuals for that. And so she, if I'm remembering correctly, literally just her and her sisters were school kids, went out late and they looked cute, dressed up, and said, "Can we come up and dance on stage?" And that was sort of how they got their first gig, was just as dancers up there at this lounge in Midtown Manhattan, where this group Joey D and the Starlighters, who were kind of this second wave rock group. I think they were out of New Jersey. I think they were mob backed. Fairly certain. I was at Ronnie's remembrance service, and Joey D was there, and he looked like somebody out of Goodfellas in this beautiful pinstripe suit. So it was kind of like rock and roll had lost some of its edge. It's a cliche, but that's kind of where it's true. And then I think Ronnie really brought a lot about that back. I mean, even with her look, she would say, we took it from the street to the stage, and I was wearing what the kids were wearing. Because if you look at girl groups, were a big sound in the early 60s. You've got the Shirelles had a hit with Carole King's "Will You Love Me Tomorrow," and they wore these big ball gowns. I mean, it looks like something you'd see at like the Grand Ole Opry or something now. These huge prom dresses, basically. And Ronnie was like, no, it's not really our thing. I mean, when they started having their dresses made, I think she had her mom or somebody in her family make them. So no, can you make them tight? Because we like to dance. That's kind of our thing. And so that is, everyone calls her the queen of rock and roll. That's sort of why. I mean, she was bringing some of that mentality back to the stage in this era of Fabian and Frankie and Annette.
Yeah, that's and Joey Diaz. He's one of those. He's one of those guys like Fabian, right? Like he
Yeah, he's a weird one. He was like one of those guys who, and I should watch what I'm saying first of all, because he's probably connected. My kneecaps could be screwed. But also, I don't know too much of his backstory. But I got the sense that he was one of those guys who was a little bit older, and he just saw like rock and roll was the sound that was happening, and so he just kind of adopted that. Was the gist that I got.
Yeah, it's too bad he didn't see Tommy James's book and think, "Ooh,
yeah, oh man,
there's money to be made here."
Oh my God. There was a story I was doing. I still hope to make it into a podcast. That was actually why I got my job at iHeart. Was I was trying to pitch this about Bobby Fuller. I fought the law about why he was killed, and no one really. I mean, he wound up dead in his car, covered in gasoline, and the cops marked it as suicide and refused to investigate further. And there's like he didn't beat himself up, cover himself with gasoline, and died in his locked car. That's not how it happened. God. And so then you started doing a little digging, and then the Morris Levy, who's a big figure in Tommy James's book. You start seeing some stories about him, and it's interesting, that whole scene.
I did not know that.
Joey D was a member of that. Yeah, Joey D was definitely in that Morris Levy Roulette Records.
This makes him a lot more interesting to me than anything that I would have picked up on with his discography.
Yes.
But anyway. All right, moving on here. So the Ronettes break through right away with their first hit, Be My Baby, and that song is an immortal classic, of that era. What do you think it is about this track specifically that makes it stand the test of time when so much of the other music of that era, including some of the girl groups, really didn't?
Well, I mean, three components. One, I think it's a beautifully written song, and that's kind of the easy one. Ronnie's voice, really, I mean, it's the perfect blend of this kind of schoolgirl vulnerability and street sass and attitude. It's like it's so wonderful. It's so unique. There's really never been anyone who sounded like her before or since. I mean, just in that voice is bewitching. I mean, you look at all the every documentary about her, and you have all the talking heads of famous singers. I mean, from Billy Joel to Bruce Springsteen to Elton John to Bowie. I mean, everybody loved her. John Lennon loved her. I mean, it was this incredibly powerful but vulnerable voice. And so I think that was a huge component of it, even though I think it was a hit song anyway. And then you got to talk about Phil Spector. You got to talk about the Wall of Sound. I mean, say what you will about how he was as a human being. And in preparation to speak to you, just for fun, I hadn't seen it. I watched the new Spector documentary or docuseries on Showtime, which was interesting. He was a genius. The Wall of Sound production. I mean, nothing sounded like that in the way that a lot of people have aped, say, Brian Wilson's sounds and done, inspired countless knockoffs that continue 55 years later. Nothing sounds like, when you go back to listen to his original, it's just, there's a depth to it. There's a complexity to it. There's a sound to it in this Wall of Sound case. I mean, it's all the words that you see.
Let's pause there for a moment, because this was going to be another thing I wanted to ask you about. The Wall of Sound is so critical to Ronnie's career, especially in the early days. But for those who might not know what that is, can you kind of in layman's terms give a definition or an explanation of what we mean by Wall of Sound?
It was a production technique that just basically oversaturate the tape. It's essentially a pop orchestra. You would have a massive group of players playing all at once, which is not done now. I mean, today when you record a song, you go track by track and record every instrument. But this is back in the 2 or 4 track era when they had to record a full, what was effectively an orchestra at once. And he would have 4 pianists, 5 guitarists, all playing at once in this tiny little room, sound bouncing everywhere, and he would rehearse them for hours. So by the time he got the take that he wanted, everybody was just like it was like breaking them down so that there was no individuality in the playing. It was just like I mean, in a way, that was the sound he wanted. He just wanted everything to sound the same. He didn't want any virtuosity. He wanted just this bombastic Wagnerian sound. And then he would the crucial element was the echo chamber at Gold Star Studios, where he liked to work, which added just drenched it with echo and reverb and made it sound even thicker. And this was back in the time when recordings were mostly released in mono, which, I mean, not to get too technical, but it made it even sound even more just like a giant concentrated block of sound, your wall of sound. I mean, it was just in stereo, you can kind of space out the recording of the instruments in the sonic field. With this, because it was mono, it just all hit you at once coming through one speaker. And it was loud. It was fairly raucous, even though he was using strings and a lot of orchestral stuff. And there was really nothing like it. It was so brash, and it was so, I mean, it's such a great oral representation of his chutzpah. I mean, it was I'm going to book every session musician in town, all the best. I'm going to keep them for hours. I'm going to play the exact same thing. And and it's incredible. It sounds like nothing's been made before or since.
Yeah, the recording sessions that Ronnie describes in her book do not sound fun at all.
No.
Were other
Trail
producers? Yeah. At the time, I mean, I know Brian Wilson drew inspiration, from it later on, but like at the time, was this technique, sort of aped or cribbed by other producers?
Yes and no. I mean, it inherently was a very costly way of working, not only booking so many people, but then it just would take so long. You had the best people playing usually overtime. And so it was kind of, you couldn't have too many people ape it in a way that was, because it wasn't efficient. And you had to have the kind of success that a Phil Spector or a Brian Wilson had, or Sonny Bono, who got his start as one of Phil's gophers. A lot of the early Sonny and Cher stuff with just Cher in the mid 60s has a lot of that kind of Baroque pop type of sound. I think just because they had the resources. And it's a very LA sound too. I don't think you don't really, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think of too many acts out of New York that had that similar type of wall of sound adjacent production. In New York, you had a lot more of I'm thinking like the Columbia Studios, where Dylan worked in the mid 60s, and Simon and Garfunkel and stuff like that. I for some reason, it seemed like a very uniquely California phenomenon. I don't know how much of that was just the style, or if there was some logistical reason that I'm not able to think of right now.
Sure.
Maybe, you know what? Maybe it was recording scores for films. Maybe the studios were better set up for that, to have
That's a good point.
I'm not sure, but
with all that orchestra factor. Yeah, that's interesting. Okay. So before we started recording, you and I were talking briefly about how Phil tanked Ronnie's career after a very short run in the mid 60s. And it's been, when you look at, say, another band like the Crystals, who he also managed, that was another group who have their discography like end suddenly on a dime in like 1965 or whatever it was. Can you talk about like how powerful Phil was as a figure as far as these careers go? I mean, or was it a matter of, were the trends changing at this point, that do you think he wanted to move I mean, we know he wanted to control Ronnie, but do you think the trends, the music trends of the '60s were moving away from girl groups? That even without his interfering, maybe groups like the Ronettes and the Crystals were on their way out, and he was maybe ahead of the curve? Or do you think he tanked still commercially viable careers for whatever petty personal reasons he had?
I mean, the thing about Phil is that I don't think it was ever about the artist. I mean, the famous story about the Crystals was that they had like three different singers, and well, two main singers. They had the young woman Lala in New York who was like 14, and she couldn't make the trip out to LA, so she got Darlene Love, and so the main Crystals group back in New York hear a song come on the radio, and they're like, "Oh, that's a good song," and then the DJ announces that it's by the Crystals, and they're not happy. They're suddenly it's just is very obvious that for Phil the artists were interchangeable. It was like a director making a movie. He was an auteur. It became about, well, this is my vision, and I want the voice to fit the part. And so I think a lot of that was it was whatever was interesting him at the time. I almost think it was less about the trends. I mean, the Crystals, I don't think had, once the Ronettes kind of became his primary focus, I don't really think that he gave them the same amount of attention that he would have the Ronettes. I mean, A, because they were they were a hit group at that point, and B, because of Ronnie, and I'm sure that had his attention too. So it's tough to say which came first. Did the girl groups start to fade and Phil pulled them back, or did girl groups start to fade because Phil kind of stopped caring? I mean, there's the famous story of Phil going over to England with the Ronettes in February of 1964, January 64, seeing the scene over there, and then hitching a ride back to New York with the Beatles. He was on the flight that the Beatles came to America for the first time on. And there's a kind of a beautiful little moment where there's the famous shot of the Beatles getting off the jet at JFK and waving and all that. And they come on down, and then a minute later, you see Phil Spector coming off that same plane, forgotten. Nobody's like looking at him or anything. And this is like the big teenage tycoon, a hitmaker of the time, seeing that his moment had just passed. So I think he kind of, when the Beatles hit, I think that kind of threw him. The Ronettes, I don't think really, because soon after that you have him working with like the Righteous Brothers, doing "You Got Lost That Love and Feeling," which I think became the most played song on the radio of all time or something. I mean, he still was doing very well, but I think it was a mix of both. I think that it was he never was especially invested in the artist per se. It was more about what he wanted to do at that given moment, and I think he recognized the sea change. And I think that also he, having Ronnie become a star in her own right, or too big of a star in her own right, one that would eclipse his own, he couldn't tolerate it. I think his ego couldn't handle it, and I think he was worried about losing her.
It is maybe one of the most, in a book full of insane stories, one of the most insane things to me is that she said that the Ronettes toured without her multiple times, and no one really seemed to notice, right?
That's what they say. I always find that shocking because Ronnie, I think, is such a singular talent, and I think was so known to real music fans. I mean, granted, the tour that she mentions specifically was touring with the Beatles in '66.
Oh, with the Beatles, they noticed and they were pissed. But those Beatles tours.
They were doing like Shea Stadium and Candlestick Park too. They probably couldn't even see who was down there.
Right. Yeah. Because that's to me one of the most interesting things about the Beatles is that there were probably very few Beatles concerts in history that were actually enjoyable, really, for anybody, because of how all the screaming and the sound quality and all that. But I guess the takeaway for me, and I'll say this on my own solo for the podcast, is this is one of the best rock biographies ever.
Yeah.
Such an incredible look back at that era. Um, but moving on here. So, we talked about, Phil's influence and domination over her. A big part of this book is her survival and escape from Phil. And when she did escape Phil and, started, tried to restart the Ronettes herself, tried to start a solo career, she got, some help from some pretty big name rock stars like Billy Joel and Bruce Springsteen. And it seemed that she was on a decade-long plus trek for a big comeback hit, and that did not come until 1986 with "Take Me Home Tonight," which she was on with Eddie Money. Why do you think it took that long for something to hit, and what was it about that song that succeeded when her earlier attempts did not seem to punch through?
That's a great question, and I don't know. I think in her book, and it's been a little while since I've read the book, but she sort of intimated to me when I was lucky enough to speak to her that there was some fear of reprisal from Phil, and there was some people who, they would help her to a point, but so I'm not sure how much of it was any kind of fear of Phil Spector versus just the change in music. I mean, music is still not great to women past a certain age, I mean, how do you think it would have been in the mid 70s? Like, I don't know. I mean,
Right.
I'm sure people were thrilled to see her, people that grew up with her, but I think it was hard for even somebody who had the full backing of a corporation, of a label, of a figure like Phil Spector to reposition her in that decade and that time. Trying to really do it on her own when she was calling in favors, not to say they weren't well-deserved favors, but calling in favors from like Murray the K, who was the famous New York DJ, and he would kind of put her on package tours and stuff in the mid 60s or mid 70s that were basically like basically golden oldies type shows that would be put on at Madison Square Garden. I think at that point she was almost just trying to eke out a living, and wasn't really at a point where she was trying to make a massive creative reinvention. I think there was really no one in her corner in a major way that was able to get her to that place yet. I know that I guess this was probably when she was still with Phil in the early 70s. They had George Harrison produced one of her songs or wrote one of her songs. Try Some, Buy Some on Apple, which is yeah.
Not great.
No. But I mean,
maybe one of the saddest stories in the book would just like she had such a big opportunity working with the Beatles when they're, on the top of the world, and like it's a joke song. Like, and the B-side is a total joke
Tandoori chicken, right?
Yeah. Disappointing.
But everybody loved her. I mean, that really was the thing. And I think that the reason that the Eddie Money song hit was because it was almost like a proto sample. I mean, it was like she was an early hook girl, kind of. I mean, in a way, and I think it was such an easy, kind of obvious way to update her sound by taking what everyone knew her for and bring it with this big-haired bum. I don't know much about Eddie Money. I stopped listening to music after 1975. So Eddie Money, aside from that, the Ronnie Spector song, I don't know too much of it.
Have you seen the music video for it at least?
Yeah.
That's a dang good music video
for
the MTV
totally.
years.
Big time.
Like I think if you're presenting like a comeback, the silhouettes, shot from a distance, like all that stuff, I get a kick out of it.
I was at her a tribute celebration of life event a few months ago, and it ended. It was so great. It was so sweet. It was like one of the sweetest public events I've ever been to. Sweetest events I've ever been to. And it ended with, I think it was a clip from that video, just sort of slowed down, where she's hair teased back in the pants and the silk blouse or whatever, just walking away from the camera into the mist. And it was so beautiful. It was such a great way to like say goodbye. I'm getting choked up just thinking about it now. It was very sweet. I think it was from that video. Cool.
So, obviously I've mentioned all kinds of things from this book. It's so fresh in my memory. But it makes me wonder because it was published originally in 1990. And, we as a culture are in such a different place, now than when it was put out. Do you know how it was initially received?
Hmm.
And did it, was it what started the public perception sort of turning on Phil, or did that really not take place until the whole, murder thing?
You know, sadly, I don't think that happened until the murder. I
Yeah.
really don't. After Ronnie's death, I spoke to her husband about the reissue of her book that she spent the last
Yeah.
weeks of her life finalizing. And he was talking to me about the book and how it was received when it first came out. And to hear him say it, and I don't know, I wasn't there personally, so I don't know, but to hear him say it, the general consensus was, oh, bitter ex-wife kind of thing.
Yeah.
Or at least
Yeah.
if that wasn't the general consensus, there was certainly a sizable populate amount of readers who came away with that, which is obviously people love the crazy genius. I think that's such a trope that they're
Yeah.
fascinated by it. And I mean, it's you forget in some ways, especially when they're violent and abusive like that too, that it actually does have real world consequences. And
Mm-hmm.
then when something like with Phil Spector murdering Lana Clarkson happens, it's almost like, for me, it's up there with like when Amy Winehouse died. It was like the most obvious thing in the world. Of course this happened. Of
Yeah.
course this happened. But it was
Yeah.
so obvious that it almost defied logic. It's like, oh, I didn't actually think that like, we all know he's nuts, but like, I didn't think it would cross into that. And then you start putting all the pieces together that you just kind of laughed off of Phil shooting the ceiling of the recording studio when he's recording with John and John Lennon and all that kind of stuff. And I think he held the Ramones at gunpoint too. Like, yeah, he played with firearms a
There
lot.
was just this story I read a week or two ago, and I don't know if this is old news, where Debbie Harry from Blondie told a story about having a meeting with Phil, and he like pulled a gun in that meeting for
I'm sure
something,
he
and
did.
she walked out of there with her producer being like, "We are not working with him."
Yeah, I mean, the stories were legendary. I think that it took a really extreme situation. I mean, like the Harvey Weinstein thing. I think
Yeah.
that it.
Yeah.
I think that they're there. I mean, he was powerful, so I think that maybe that people don't want to necessarily come out and be too explicit about what happened to them. But yeah, these stories were in rock and roll legend for years before, and I think people just kind of expected it in a way.
Yeah, I mean, it's so much different than when you're like reading about something from afar versus being the human being that's on the other end of, well, that violence and that chaos and insanity.
Yeah.
That's less charming.
I think the thing that really turned the tide of her kind of public reputation. I mean, everybody always loved Ronnie, but she did
Yeah.
a one woman show
Oh,
in England and here, and I forget what it was called. It was something like Madness Mask. It was very similar to
oh,
her
okay.
memoir title, and that, I mean, as you said, it's a lot different when you have somebody telling you, who's standing in front of you, what happened to them and sharing their story. And I think that went a long way in the late 2000s through to mid 2010s in kind of helping this kind of groundswell of in addition to the changing culture
Yeah.
and the Me Too movement and so forth.
Yes, I would say this. I have to assume this book, reads a lot differently now in the aftermath of Me Too versus,
Yeah.
when it originally came out. Okay. So you mentioned earlier, well, no, you didn't mention this earlier, but the reason why I wanted to have you specifically on for this episode is that you interviewed Ronnie a couple of times. While doing research on her life, I came across your interviews with her in People magazine, and I'm going to include all of those
Oh,
links in
thank
the
you.
description. Uh, she comes across as so charming and fun. Can you talk a little bit about
Oh
what she was
man.
like on a personal level?
the best. I mean, of course, John Lennon, David Bowie, Jimi
Yeah.
Hendrix, Brian Wilson, Billy Joel, Bruce Springsteen, Stevie Van Zandt fall in love with her. Like, of course,
Yeah.
it was just, oh yeah. I mean, she was just the most warm, genuine, funny, one of the most special people I've ever interviewed. It was great. I've interviewed her a number of times. The main one that I remember was when I actually went up to where she lived in Connecticut, and we met at one of her favorite restaurants nearby, this little steakhouse. And we just spent the afternoon hours in just a booth in the steakhouse off in the corner. And she was hysterical. I mean, she was every inch a star, but not in a grand way, in a very sweet, funny way. She kept her sunglasses on indoors the whole time, full face of makeup, big red lipstick, hair exactly as you'd want, one of the Ronettes to have, all big bouffant, beehive. Oh, she was wonderful. And it was so funny because I think I'm allowed to to say this. We've been talking about doing like a big sit down interview with her for a couple months, with speaking with her publicist, who's a lovely guy. And he kind of kept saying that, please don't don't go in on the Phil stuff, like it's very traumatic for her, like this is like. And I was like, yeah, of course, like why would I don't especially want to dredge that stuff up, like I'm a serious fan, like I love her and I love her music and I think she's the best, and I just am, frankly, I'll write whatever she says. I'm just happy to be with her. So I go up there, and I brought, just to be, I don't know, I brought my 45s, my old Ronettes 45s from the 60s, just to show, like, no, for real, like this is, I love your music, I have it all, this is how I like to listen to it. And she's going through them, and she flipped it to the back, and she said, oh yeah, I see all the B-sides. Yeah, the B-sides were like, he used to stick like random people's names as like the co-writers on those songs to give people he owed money to. Phil did. Oh, he was such a snake. And literally, like, as soon as she's off and running about what a snake Phil was for like 45 minutes, and I'm looking at the PR person being like, I didn't do it, I'm sorry.
Right.
And so she, I mean, the point of this was that she was not, for all the things that happened to her, and I really want this to come through, she was not a traumatized victim by any stretch. She was proud, she was strong, she was very proud of what she'd been through. As proud of escaping Phil's house barefoot with no money in 1972 as she was hitting, number 2, whatever it was, with Be My Baby. I like that she survived that. And she really spent the latter few decades of her life wanting to help people. She said that, her husband said that, and I saw her do that with her show and with this book. She really wanted to be an advocate for women, or anyone, to get out of bad relationships. And that was something that she would say again and again, like, when you hear my voice, I want you to know that, like, you can make it through hell, like you can survive. Like, when you hear me on the radio, you hear me in a movie, like, just, that's what I want you to take away from that. And so she was a really cool lady, and we became like, this is strange to say, I mean, I'm not going to say that we weren't friends by any stretch of the imagination, but we've ended up following each other on social media, and it was her. And so I'd post pictures of me and my girlfriend or whatever, and she would comment like an auntie or something, like, oh, it looks so cute, nice sweater, like, oh, just like very, it was like, again, she ended up becoming like this weird social media pen pal type relationship with her.
That's so sweet.
And I was a DJ. I love DJing old 45s and stuff, doing like sock hop nights. And whenever I would play one of her songs, I would always make a little video of it and DM it to her. And it was her. It was,
great.
She told me that it was her, like actually on. And I would send it to her just to let her know, because she got such a kick out of like 20 somethings dancing their music. She couldn't get over it. Like, she would say people come up to her after her show dressed like her, but they're, in their 20s. She just thought that was the coolest thing, and she couldn't get over it. So yeah, she was a really, really special person. She never because it was the strangest thing, because she lived up in Connecticut in a small town, and it was this funny dual lifestyle where she was a suburban mom and she was the
Yeah.
queen of rock and roll. So she would go out to Bed Bath and Beyond. That was her husband told me that was like her favorite place to go, Bed Bath and Beyond, or the supermarket, and always wear a full face of makeup and have the hair up and the glasses, because she said, "Oh yeah, well, nobody wants autographs anymore. People just want pictures. So whenever they see me, they was, so I want to make sure I look good and give them what they want," which is so cute. And I remember she told me she was just like in line at a grocery store waiting to check out, and one of her songs came on the PA, and she just said, "Yeah, it's just I wanted to scream, it's me. It's just there's this funny dual life." Yeah, she was everything you would ever want her to be. Any fans of her listening right now, I want to make sure that comes across. She was
Yeah.
a really awesome woman.
That is so great to hear. It's also very charming to watch her acceptance speech at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Comes
Yeah,
across as very genuine and human. Did she
yeah.
ever talk about in your interviews with her, or maybe even outside of that, did she ever talk about, like, retrospectively, where she saw herself in pop music history?
Um, she was very aware of people who looked up to her.
Yeah.
In a very um generous way, in the way that a big sister would. People like your Joan Jetts, Amy Winehouse, she thought was
Oh,
supremely talented,
yeah.
and spoke at length, because Ronnie dealt with some substance abuse issues of her own as well,
Sure.
and spoke at length about what a tragedy Amy's story was, and all the ways that she wished she could have helped her more and things like that. So she was aware that there were people who looked up to her and emulated her. I don't think she was the type to really think in terms of my legacy. You know what I mean? Like I think it was almost much more of a personal human thing, with like, oh, these girls, that was how she would say, like, oh yeah, these
Yeah.
girls who, like, wear their hair like me and stuff, and love that sound, and will come and see my shows and stuff. So she was very aware of
Maybe
that.
more like a cultural hit, maybe like an American pop culture, because uh, her cousin at the Rock Hall, I remember,
Oh,
gave
Nedra,
some
yeah.
interesting remarks, about, she said, like, at the time we didn't realize that we were setting like fashion, that young girls were looking up to, you know.
That's true. I mean, she definitely, when they were performing in the 60s, they just wore what they wanted to wear, not because they
Yeah,
wanted to.
yeah,
It wasn't like a David Bowie thing where it was,
right.
I'm gonna make a statement now. This was just, that was what we thought looked cool. We wanted to look
Yeah.
cool. Like, that was as far as I think they were looking. So I think that and she would say to me, and her husband said this to me too, she never had a glam squad. It was just like her and
Oh,
a can
yeah,
of Aquanet.
yeah,
She and attitude, a hell of a lot of attitude
yeah.
is really what it was. And that was kind of the thing that she would always say, like, we were aware, we dressed how we wanted to dress, but a lot of it was just the attitude and how we carried ourselves.
Did you ever get a chance to see her perform?
Yeah, I did. It was part of a bigger event. I'm trying to remember what it was. So she only did a few songs, which I'm very sad about now.
Yeah.
Um, oh, it's great. I mean, again, I I wasn't someone who took the story on as an assignment and then grew to appreciate her. I was a fan. I mean,
Yeah, yeah,
I made the stories happen because I wanted to go talk to her and
yeah.
hear her story and learn more about her. Um, I've rarely been in a room, maybe with Bruce Springsteen, maybe Paul McCartney, in a concert setting where there's that much goodwill directed at one figure.
Oh,
I mean, that was
oh, that's
my
awesome.
main memory.
Yeah.
And the other thing, I mean, getting back to what she was like, um, one on one. I mean, she she knew how to make whoever she was with feel very special. I remember after one of the concerts I took her to, one of the concerts I saw her at, my girlfriend came with me, and we went backstage to say hi to her. And my girlfriend wore a Ronettes inspired type
Oh,
suit, and it has similar hair as Ronnie. And Ronnie first thing was, "You have the most gorgeous hair," and she went over and was like playing with it, and I was like, "Oh my god, Ronnie Spector, like the queen of the Beehive, like the
yeah.
coolest, one of the coolest people, one of the coolest, queen of rock and roll, is like, going out of her way to just like make my girlfriend feel like $1,000,000." And like, I just thought
Oh,
that
that's
was
awesome.
the nicest thing. Yeah.
Very cool, very cool. All right. Well, that does remind me of a video I saw where she's singing, she's hanging out with Brian Wilson backstage, and she sings a song to him, and right at the end of the video, the cameraman asks him about it, and he just says very quickly and very seriously that it was the thrill of his lifetime. And
Oh
like
yeah.
all the comments below are like, he might be a weird guy, but he means that. You know?
Oh, yes. She was not afraid. It's the other thing, to just sing in the middle of a restaurant.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
When I yeah, one of the and oh, are you kidding? The first time I interviewed her, she sang a little bit. It was a phoner, and she sang down the phone, "Someone
Oh,
Be My Baby" to
great.
me, right
Yeah.
into my ear, because
Yeah.
and it was just like, oh my God, yeah,
Yeah.
your heart definitely skips a beat. Yeah,
Oh, that's so cool.
she knew how to make people feel special, both on stage and one on one, and it came from a very genuine place. You can't fake that, especially
Yeah.
I've been like lucky, doesn't even begin to describe it, but I'll use that word. I've been lucky enough to speak to and be in the room with a lot of my heroes, and they've all been wonderful, but there's a reserve there and a remove there, and you know what, that they are there to do a job. With
Yeah.
Ronnie, it definitely transcended that. It really felt, it came from somewhere deeper with her. I got the sense that
No, for sure.
she appreciated her fans and the journalists there to speak to her, and anyone who was nice to her or supported to her. I think she appreciated them as much as we did her and her music.
Excellent. All right. Last question before we get out of here. You mentioned your 45s collection. When looking at her discography, how about this? Let's say excluding that mid 60s heyday, are
Mhm.
there other chunks of her discography that you would point people who aren't necessarily, very familiar to her work to? What would be the first stuff that comes to mind that you think they should check out?
I'm really glad you asked that, because I really enjoy, and not many people, not to sound like Michael Caine, not many people know this.
Yeah.
There's stuff that she did before Phil as the
Oh,
Ronettes on Colpix. I think it's Colpix Records.
yeah.
Producer named Stu. I'm blanking on his last name. I'm sorry. And there's some fun early stuff. A song called "Good Girls." That's the stuff I used to play out because I didn't want to give Phil any extra shine. So I
Ah,
usually, whenever I'd play out and I'd take a video of people dancing, I would always play one of those because
yeah.
yeah. There's an album, a compilation album, and I wish I'd brushed up on this, but it exists, of all the pre Phil Spector Ronette stuff.
Oh, yeah. The
It
Colpix years. That's on her
yeah,
website.
okay, it's on our website. Yeah,
Yeah.
that stuff's great. I mean, it doesn't have the Phil Spector wall of sound,
Sure.
bombast stuff, but it's good. It sounds a lot like the kind of girl group stuff that was happening earlier in the 60s, like the Shirelles. That's really fun. Yeah, Good Girls is it's a great
Very
track.
cool.
That was one of her favorites too, that she always loved.
Oh, I dig that. All right, awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on.
Oh, my
I'm going
pleasure.
to link your interviews with her in the description below, because those were great
Oh,
resources for
thank
me just
you.
to learn about her. And the other reason why I wanted to have you on the show is that you host not well, you hosted one and you host another of my favorite podcasts, Too Much Information.
Oh, thank you.
The previous show you did, Rivals with Stephen Hayden, is another one that I really liked as a music fan. But you're doing TMI now, which is just as good, if not better. So could you tell us, for those who don't know, a little bit about TMI?
Oh, TMI. I mean, it's aptly named. Let me put it that way. Too much information. Um, my friend and I spent many years writing listicles for various websites, and a lot of writers kind of look down their nose at that because it's the lowest, barely journalism. It's just facts in a list. We always loved it because we're research nerds. We love to learn about stuff. I mean, for me, the best part of the whole gig is you get paid to learn and share that with others. That's pretty cool. So and it's also it's celebratory. So much spite and bile on the internet. Like we would do.
Oh yeah.
Fun facts about movies and TV shows and music that people loved and got excited about. So that was always cool. So my dream was to do a show that was basically an audio listicle, where every episode we take a different movie, a different TV show, or a different album or song, and just talk about all the little known behind the scenes stories and details that went into the making of it. And it's been fun. We go twice a week. We launched in April. And yeah, every episode is just one topic. We had one out today on Home Alone. We've done a lot of Christmas ones lately.
Yep.
What about, speaking of Amy Winehouse, we did one on the making of Back to Black recently. Oh my gosh, I mean we've done so many, a lot of like 90s nostalgia type stuff, Legends of the Hidden Temple and Nickelodeon kinds of things, and Full House, and yeah, classic movies too. We've done Cool Hand Luke, and I'm trying to think, I think we have Aladdin coming up, and yeah, it's really fun. And because I mean the best part about it for me, and I hope other people get this too, is that you really makes you kind of appreciate these classics that we just kind of don't even see anymore because they've just become so part of our DNA almost, that you revisit them when kind of what went into making them. I hope it leads to a new kind of appreciation for them. So that's really fun. And I hosted with my friend Alex Heigl, who's a brilliant writer and musician, and he works now out at the San Francisco Conservatory, and he's like a classically trained musician. So when we talk about music stuff, like he always adds a really interesting insight into music theory and all this stuff that I'm kind of hopeless about. So it's fun. It's fun.
Well, it definitely, all that comes through so well. What I like about the show is that what you said about not being like negative and snarky, there's so much of that already online, and the enthusiasm and love for the stuff that you guys are talking about is what comes through more than anything else.
Oh, I'm
and
glad to
even
hear
when
that.
you guys do get a little snarky, it's the sort of snarky that only can come from someone who loves the thing they're talking about. Only someone who knows that much about something. So when I listen to as I was saying to you earlier, I listened to the one about Fleetwood Mac Rumors because Christine McVie passed away. I was in my car driving, listening to it, laughing out loud at so many of the crazy things that you guys talked about. So it comes through really well. That's a huge reason why I wanted to have you on the show, and I hope you come back.
Oh, anytime. Thank you so much for having me.
Awesome. Well, I guess we can call it here. Thank you again so much, dude.
Oh,
I really
my pleasure.
appreciate this.
Oh, please. Thank you. It was such a joy. Thank you. I'm honored you even thought of me. Thank you.